The Complete Travels of Gandalf Before the Lord of the Rings. What if I told you that every time Gandalf disappeared, every unexplained absence, every moment where the old wizard was simply not where you needed him, was not wandering? What if the gaps were the plan? Not a plan written down somewhere, not orders handed down from Manwë on a parchment sealed with light. Something stranger. A plan lived out across 2,000 years of careful movement, quiet conversation, and deliberate choice, by a being who understood something none of his peers were willing to accept, that the war against Sauron could not be won by power. It had to be won by something much harder to manufacture, and much easier to lose. This is not speculation pulled from nowhere. This is what the text actually says when you follow it all the way down, through the appendices and into unfinished tales, through the letters Tolkien wrote when he was trying to explain to himself what he had built, and into the Silmarillion, where Gandalf's name is not even Gandalf yet, and his nature is already completely recognizable. The picture that assembles from all of those pieces is not the wandering sage of the films. It is something closer to a surgeon, operating across centuries, with the lightest possible touch, on a patient who could not know he was being operated on. Here is the question this script is going to sit with. If Gandalf spent 2,000 years preparing Middle-earth for a war he could see coming, and still nearly failed at every critical moment, was his restraint the only thing that could have saved it? Or was it the very thing that almost destroyed it? Do not answer that yet. We have to earn the answer, and to earn it, we have to go back, all the way back, to a harbor at the edge of the world, and a gift given before a single thing had been done to deserve it. Círdan the shipwright is one of the most underwritten figures in the entire legendarium, which is remarkable given who he was. He is one of the oldest elves in Middle-earth during the Third Age, perhaps the oldest still living on the mortal shore. He was present at the awakening of the elves at Cuiviénen. He watched Beleriand drown. He ferried the departing across the sea for millennium after millennium, standing at the last dock in the world and saying goodbye to everyone he had ever known, and then watching the sea for the next ones to say goodbye to. Círdan had seen more endings than almost any other creature in Tolkien's world, and by TA 1000, approximately, when 5 strange figures arrived at the Grey Havens from the west, Círdan was still there, still watching. 5 figures arrived. Tolkien describes them in Unfinished Tales, in the essay called The Istari, as appearing old but vigorous, carrying staffs, wearing robes of different colors, and possessing no clear declaration of their nature or purpose. To anyone observing, they were wanderers, elderly men of some obvious dignity, arriving from the sea, with nothing to immediately distinguish one from another, except those robes. Gray, white, brown, 2 in sea blue, 5 figures standing on the dock at the end of the world. Círdan looked at them and immediately knew which one to trust with his ring. Pay attention to this, because this is the first and most important event in the entire timeline of Gandalf's life in Middle-earth, and it happens before he has done anything, before he has spoken to a single king, or encouraged a single frightened shepherd, or sent a single message that would spiral out into a chain of events that would reshape the world. Before he is Gandalf at all. He is still Olorin, wearing the body of an old man, standing on a dock in the Third Age, and Círdan gives him Narya. Narya, the Ring of Fire, one of the 3 elven rings, the one Círdan himself had been given to keep, to use, to bear. Not Narya as a courtesy, not Narya as a gift between equals, Narya with a specific charge. Tolkien records Círdan's words in the essay, and they are extraordinary. He tells Gandalf, in substance, that his is the greatest labor and the heaviest burden of all who have come, and that the ring is given to aid him against weariness, despair, and the shadow of Sauron's dominion, so that the hearts of those he encounters might be kindled to courage. The greatest labor and the heaviest burden. Círdan has been alive since before the sun was made. He has watched the Ainur shape history. He has seen the Maiar act in the world before, in forms far more terrible and far more magnificent than these 5 elderly wanderers. And in looking at Gandalf, the one in grey who appeared oldest and most worn even among his peers, he did not see a wandering sage. He saw something that was going to cost more than any of the others, something that was going to require sustaining against weariness and despair specifically, not against defeat in battle, against the long grind of a work that would never look like winning. And he gave him a ring without being asked. Now think about what that actually means. Narya is one of the 3 rings forged by Celebrimbor that Sauron never touched, never contaminated, never bent. The 3 do not dominate or possess. They preserve, they heal, they kindle. Círdan has understood something about Gandalf's mission that Gandalf perhaps did not fully understand yet himself, that the danger was not going to be Sauron's armies. The danger was going to be the slow erosion of the will to resist. Century after century of Sauron gathering strength in the east, while the free peoples bickered and forgot, and despaired and abandoned one another. The danger was entropy, and Narya was designed exactly for that. Designed to push back against the cold, to keep the small fires of courage burning in hearts that had nearly given up. Círdan gave Gandalf the right tool. The question is whether Gandalf knew how long he was going to need it. Here is something the movies never show you. The other Istari did not receive the same welcome. Saruman received his white robes and his leadership of the Order, and eventually his seat on the White Council. And the appendices and unfinished tales together make clear that he considered himself the preeminent of the 5, from very early on. His power was real. His knowledge of the rings, their craft and their history, was genuinely vast, and he pursued that knowledge with exactly the kind of obsessive expertise that makes people in the world of power take you seriously. The 2 blue wizards, LOTR and Pallando, went east into regions that Tolkien's primary texts barely map, and Tolkien himself said in a late letter that he feared they had become the founders of secret cults and magic traditions, having lost the thread of their mission entirely. Radagast settled into the forests and the birds and the beasts, and while Tolkien's view of him was complicated and not entirely dismissive, it is clear that by the War of the Ring, Radagast's primary loyalty was to the natural world rather than to the free peoples, in the sense Gandalf understood the mission. So within a few centuries of arrival, the 5 are already diverging, and Gandalf is doing something none of the others are doing, or at least not in the same way, or with the same commitment. He is walking, everywhere, talking to everyone, accepting nothing that would settle him in one place, or give him permanent authority over any one people or kingdom. Picture this. Sometime in the early 2nd millennium of the Third Age, roughly 1,000 years after his arrival, a figure in grey appears on a road at the edge of a village in Eriador, somewhere between the Misty Mountains and the Blue Mountains, in a region of scattered men who have no particular king, and no particular fame, and no particular reason to matter to anyone. He sits down by the road. He lights a pipe, perhaps, or builds a small fire. A child wanders over, then a few more, then a grown man who is suspicious but curious. Gandalf talks. He asks more questions than he answers. He learns names. He learns histories. He learns which families are feuding and which streams run dry in summer, and which winters have been hard and which harvests have been good. He learns everything. And then, at some point, he says something that one particular person in that village has needed to hear for years without knowing they needed to hear it. Something that plants itself in their chest like a seed. And then he leaves. He does not come back to that village for a decade, maybe 2. But when he does come back, he remembers every name. This is Olorin's gift. This is what the Valaquenta tells us about him in the Silmarillion, in a passage so understated it is easy to read right past it. Tolkien writes that Olorin was a Maya of Manwë and Varda, the wisest of the Maiar, and that he moved unseen among the elves in Valinor, putting fair visions into their minds, and healing the sorrows of those who had despaired, not dominating, not commanding, not even teaching in any formal sense, moving through the population like warmth through stone, leaving everyone slightly less cold than he found them. 2,000 years of that, across an entire continent. The scale of it is almost incomprehensible. Which is exactly why, when you only have the films, you miss it entirely. Saruman had a seat. He had Orthanc, which he took for his own with council sanction around TA 2759, and he transformed it over the following centuries into a fortress of intelligence and industry, and, eventually, of obsession. He had an address. If you needed Saruman, you went to Isengard. He was findable. He was permanent. He accumulated things, knowledge of the rings, armies, machinery, political influence over Rohan, a spy network that eventually extended across a significant portion of Middle-earth. And none of it was enough. Because Saruman was building something for himself, even when he told himself he was building it for the war against Sauron. Tolkien is absolutely clear about this in the text and in the letters. By the time of the War of the Ring, Saruman has spent so long contemplating the One Ring, so long tracing every thread of its making and its power, that he has convinced himself he deserves it, that he could use it, that the world would be better with the ring in Saruman's hand than in Sauron's, and possibly in Saruman's hand than in anyone else's at all. This is the trajectory of power without restraint. This is what the mission was always vulnerable to. And Gandalf saw it coming. Whether he saw it in Saruman specifically, or simply understood the risk in the abstract, his entire method of operation was the anti-Saruman. Where Saruman accumulated, Gandalf dispersed. Where Saruman built walls, Gandalf built roads. Where Saruman collected, Gandalf gave away. He gave away knowledge, trust, encouragement, fire. He never kept any of it for himself. But here is where it gets interesting, because this restraint was not without cost. Every gift Gandalf gave was a gift he could not spend twice. Every relationship he invested in was time he was not spending somewhere else. Every decision to wander west when the threat was east, or south when the danger was north, was a calculated sacrifice with real consequences. 2,000 years of that kind of accounting, and the ledger is never clean. Let us look at what the appendices actually give us, because the timeline is sparse but devastating once you see it whole. TA 1000. The Istari arrive, approximately. Círdan gives Narya to Gandalf. TA 2463. Gandalf enters Dol Guldur, the fortress of the Necromancer in Mirkwood, to discover who is there. The Necromancer flees. Gandalf does not yet confirm it is Sauron. TA 2460. The Necromancer returns to Dol Guldur with greater power. The Watchful Peace, the period of relative stability, ends. TA 2463. The White Council is formed. Gandalf is offered its leadership and refuses, and Saruman takes the role instead. TA 2470 or thereabouts. Smeagol, having killed his cousin Déagol for the One Ring, retreats to the Misty Mountains. TA 2485. Gandalf first enters the Shire, per the appendices. TA 2850. Gandalf enters Dol Guldur again, in secret, and this time confirms the Necromancer is Sauron, and finds Thrain II imprisoned there, and receives from him the map and key of Erebor. TA 2851. The White Council meets. Gandalf urges an attack on Dol Guldur. Saruman overrules him, and it is later revealed that Saruman did so because he hoped the One Ring might surface near Dol Guldur, and he could find it. TA 2941. The Quest of Erebor. Smaug is destroyed. The Battle of Five Armies. Gandalf attends the White Council's attack on Dol Guldur, which drives Sauron out, though it turns out to be a planned retreat. TA 2944. Sauron returns to Mordor openly. TA 3001. Bilbo's farewell party. Gandalf begins to suspect the ring. TA 3018. Gandalf confirms the ring to Frodo. The Fellowship is formed. Just look at that spread. TA 1000 to TA 318. 2018 years. And that chronology, sparse as it is, tells a story if you know how to read it. Notice what is missing. There is almost nothing between TA 1000 and TA 2063. Over 1,000 years with no milestone recorded. 1,000 years in which Gandalf was somewhere, doing something, building something, and the appendices simply do not have room for it. Tolkien knew this, and he says so in the letters, that Gandalf's life between major events was not empty, but full of exactly the kind of work that does not make chronicles, because it is not dramatic enough to record. Conversations, roads walked, fires kindled, trust built with people whose names were not famous enough to make the tale. Here is what the appendices actually say, in their brevity, that almost nothing Gandalf did before TA 2063 was important enough to be a dateable event. And this is not failure, this is the work. Now we have to talk about the moment that changes everything, because somewhere in those undocumented centuries, Gandalf discovered the Shire. TA 2485. That is the year the appendices give for Gandalf's first recorded entry into the Shire. The hobbits had been living in the Shire since TA 1601, when they received the grant of land from the King of Arnor, and crossed the Baranduin, which they renamed the Brandywine. That is nearly 900 years before Gandalf showed up. 900 years in which hobbits were living their quiet, sensible, agricultural lives in a corner of Eriador, and the Grey Wizard had not yet found his way to their door. Or had he? Because the appendices say first recorded entry, and there is a distinction there that matters. Gandalf is not the kind of figure whose movements are comprehensively documented. The appendices record milestone events, not every road taken. The possibility that Gandalf had moved through areas near the Shire, had heard of these small folk, had perhaps had brief early encounters that did not rise to the level of a noted event, is entirely consistent with what we know of his method. But what we know for certain is this. By TA 2485, Gandalf was going to the Shire deliberately enough that it registered. And by the time Bilbo Baggins was born in TA 2890, Gandalf was already described in the appendices as a friend of the hobbits. Not a known figure, not a visitor of note, not someone they had heard stories about. A friend. That distinction matters enormously. 400 years of building that friendship. 400 years before he needed the hobbits for anything. Think about that. Alongside the accusation you can make about Gandalf, the accusation that Frodo makes implicitly, and that the scouring of the Shire makes explicit, which is that Gandalf could have protected the Shire from Saruman's occupation, and did not, that he left it vulnerable, that he treated it as expendable, that he used the hobbits as instruments in a war they never asked to be part of, and then failed to protect them when the war came home. Is that fair? Here is what I would put against it. 400 years of visits, of fireworks at midsummer parties, of pipe smoke on hobbit doorsteps, of learning names and genealogies, because Tolkien tells us in the prologue that Gandalf took a particular interest in the intricate family trees of Shire society, which nobody else found interesting at all, of finding Bilbo's grandfather, the Old Took, and apparently developing a real friendship that lasted through an entire hobbit life, of caring about a people who had no strategic value at all to anyone who was thinking about strategy. That is not the behavior of someone running an intelligence operation with hobbit-flavored cover. That is someone who genuinely loved them, and that genuine love is precisely what made him able to trust that they could bear what he was going to ask them to bear, because he knew them well enough to know it was true. Picture this. Sometime around TA 2800, 70 or 80 years before Bilbo's birth, Gandalf sits at the table of the Old Took in Bag End, or possibly in whatever smaller hole preceded it, smoking that extraordinary pipe that the Gaffer's family would one day remember, and listening to a very old hobbit talk about the Shire as though it is the whole world. And it is, for that hobbit. The Shire is the whole world. The East, Mirkwood, the Necromancer, the long shadow gathering beyond the mountains. All of that is not merely distant, but genuinely inconceivable, outside the frame of experience entirely. And Gandalf does not correct this. He does not say, There are things beyond your fields that would unwrite everything you believe is safe. He smokes his pipe and listens and watches the fire and thinks something that the text does not record but that we can feel the shape of. That these people are going to matter. That they do not know it yet. That perhaps that is exactly why they are going to matter. But before we can follow that thread to its conclusion, we have to talk about what Gandalf was facing in the east, because the quiet work in the Shire and the Westlands was not happening in isolation. It was happening under the shadow of something growing, the necromancer of Dol Guldur. This is the name Gandalf was tracking for centuries before he confirmed who it was. Tolkien's world runs on the logic of slow return. Sauron was diminished by the destruction of Númenor in the Second Age, diminished again by the cutting of the ring from his hand by Isildur, and in both cases he required time, enormous amounts of time, to rebuild himself to a state where he could act in the world again. The Third Age is, in one sense, just the very long countdown to Sauron's third attempt, and Gandalf knew this, not precisely, not with dates or certainty, but he knew the nature of the threat, and he knew it was not going away. In TA 2063, Gandalf went to Dol Guldur. Unfinished Tales gives us more texture on this than the appendices alone. Gandalf entered the fortress of the Necromancer in disguise, with exactly the level of courage this implies, which is to say, enormous. The Necromancer was a power that had already caused the watchful peace to become increasingly watchful and decreasingly peaceful, a presence in Mirkwood that was poisoning the entire forest and driving the dwarves and men of that region into increasing desperation. Gandalf went in to find out who it was, and the Necromancer fled. Now here is the part nobody talks about. Sauron, or whatever power it was in Dol Guldur, was not driven out by force. Gandalf did not fight his way in and compel a retreat. The presence simply left, apparently aware that Gandalf was coming and unwilling to be identified. Which tells you something important about what Gandalf was. Even then, he was not weak enough to simply ignore. He was dangerous enough that confirming him as an enemy was apparently not worth it. Not yet. Not in TA 2063, when Sauron was still rebuilding. The withdrawal from Dol Guldur was tactical. It was Sauron going quiet and letting suspicion drain away so he could return stronger. Which he did. TA 2460. Almost 400 years later. The Necromancer came back to Dol Guldur with greater force, and the watchful peace ended. 400 years. Think about what Gandalf did in those 400 years. The appendices give us almost nothing for this stretch, almost nothing datable. But we know from everything else in the Legendarium that Gandalf was not at rest. He was in Eriador, and along the Anduin, and in Rohan, which was receiving its land grant from Gondor in TA 2510, and somewhere in those centuries, he was building the relationships and the webs of trust that would eventually allow him to hold a disparate coalition together across an entire war. He was meeting the ancestors of Théoden and Denethor and Aragorn, or meeting people who would tell those ancestors stories about the old wandering wizard that would make their descendants trust him when the time came. But here is what I keep coming back to. Gandalf confirmed the Necromancer was gathering strength again in TA 2460, and he urged the White Council to act in TA 2851, nearly 400 more years between the return of the threat and his first formal push to confront it. And Saruman blocked him. The question of Saruman blocking Gandalf's motion to attack Dol Guldur in TA 2851 is one of the most consequential moments in the entire history of the Third Age, and it gets almost no attention because it happens before The Hobbit, and because the full truth of it is buried in The Quest of Erebor in Unfinished Tales. Saruman blocked the attack because he wanted the One Ring to surface. He believed that the ring, having had its master away from Mordor for long enough, might have tried to find its way back, and that it might have drifted down the Anduin toward the sea, and that it might conceivably have come to rest somewhere near Dol Guldur, where he could find it before anyone else did. He was lying to the White Council, not yet overtly, not yet in the way he would lie later, but already performing a calculation that placed his own acquisition of power above the security of Middle-earth. Gandalf knew this, or suspected it, or at minimum knew that Saruman's reasoning was wrong even if he did not know exactly why it was wrong. And he was overruled anyway, because Saruman was the head of the White Council, and Gandalf had refused that role, and the structure of the council was such that its leader's judgment prevailed. This is the moment where Gandalf's refusal of authority came back to bite him. He had turned down the leadership of the White Council. Tolkien confirms this in the text of the Fellowship of the Ring itself, through Gandalf's own account at the Council of Elrond. He refused it because he did not want the authority, because he feared what taking the seat would do to him, because the kinds of decisions that come with leadership are exactly the kinds of decisions that begin to corrupt. And Galadriel had wanted him in that seat, had actually advocated for him, because she too understood that Gandalf's nature was the safest nature for that kind of power. He said no. And years later, Saruman said no on behalf of the council, and the attack on Dol Guldur did not happen when it should have, and Sauron had another 90 years to gather himself before the White Council finally acted in TA 2941. Was Gandalf right to refuse the leadership? We are going to come back to that question. But not yet. First we have to talk about the dwarves, and the dragon, and the most audacious covert operation in the history of the Third Age. The Quest of Erebor is one of the most important texts in the entire legendarium for understanding Gandalf, and it is one of the least read because it exists only in unfinished tales and was never adapted into the films with any fidelity to its actual content. Tolkien wrote it as an account by Gandalf himself, told to Frodo and the other members of the Fellowship after the War of the Ring, explaining why he engineered the quest to Erebor and what his actual reasons were. And those reasons are not the reasons Thorin thought they were. Here is what Gandalf says, in substance, in that text. Around TA 2850, he entered Dol Guldur in secret, disguised, and confirmed that the necromancer was indeed Sauron. He also found, in the dungeons of Dol Guldur, a dwarf dying of imprisonment and long shadow. That dwarf was Thrawn II, the king under the mountain in exile, Thorin's father, who had wandered into darkness years earlier and been captured and never heard from again. And from Thrawn's failing hand, Gandalf received a key and a map, the map of Erebor, and the key to the secret door. Gandalf came away from Dol Guldur in possession of Thrawn's legacy, the legacy that should have gone to Thorin, and he carried it for a decade before the right moment came to use it. And the right moment was not about the dwarves. The right moment was about the dragon. Smaug was a problem, not simply for the dwarves who had lost their home, not simply for the men of Dale who had lost their city, but for the entire strategic situation in the north, because Smaug was a weapon, not a weapon that Sauron controlled, not yet, but a weapon that Sauron could conceivably use. A dragon of that power, sitting atop the greatest dwarf horde in the world, positioned in the Lonely Mountain at the northern end of the Misty Mountains, was a natural ally for any power seeking to close off the north. If Sauron moved first, if he found a way to bring Smaug under his influence, or simply to direct him southward toward Rivendell, the consequences were almost unthinkable. Gandalf thought them anyway. Here is what Unfinished Tales has him say, that a dragon, Fire Drake of the North, able to desolate a countryside in a night, under the dominion of the Dark Lord, would be a calamity, and that Rivendell, Elrond's house, his actual house, was directly in the path of what such an assault would look like. Pay attention to this, because it changes how you understand the entire plot of The Hobbit. Gandalf did not engineer the quest of Erebor because he liked Bilbo Baggins, or because he thought Thorin deserved his inheritance back, or because the dwarves needed help and he happened to be available. He engineered it because Smaug had to die before Sauron could weaponize him, and the most elegant way to kill a dragon guarding an impregnable mountain was to send in a burglar, and the burglar had to be a hobbit. Why a hobbit? Gandalf answers this too, in The Quest of Erebor. He had been thinking about hobbits for a long time. He had been visiting them for 4 centuries. He had seen something in them that everyone else in the serious political world of Middle-earth overlooked entirely. Their extraordinary imperviousness to certain kinds of corruption. Their deep-rootedness in the small and the particular. The way that Hobbit courage, when it existed, was not the performing kind, not the kind that needs an audience or a legend, but the kind that simply gets the job done because the job needs doing, and here you are. Gandalf had also, specifically, been watching Bilbo. He had known Bilbo's mother Belladonna Took, one of the 3 remarkable daughters of the old Took, and he knew the Took blood ran strong in her children, even if they were married into the respectable Baggins family, with its respectable hobbit hole and its extraordinary normality. He knew Bilbo better than Bilbo knew himself. And when the moment came, when he needed a 14th member for a dwarf company heading to a dragon's mountain, the choice was not random. It was the result of 4 centuries of investment in a people, and 40 years of specific observation of a specific hobbit, all converging on a morning in April, in the Third Age, when Gandalf stood in front of a perfectly round green door and knocked. Picture this, Gandalf on the road to Bag End, sometime in TA 2941, walking the familiar paths of the Shire with a purpose nobody watching him would detect, because he looks as he always looks, old, unhurried, trailing pipe smoke, perfectly at home on a hobbit road. But in his coat, or in his mind, or simply in the long memory that he has been building for 2,000 years, is a calculation. A map, a key, a dragon's location, a window of time before Sauron can move, a dwarf company grieving their exile, a white council that will not act on Dol Guldur when he needs them to, a burglar he has been preparing, without Bilbo's knowledge, for 40 years. He knocks on the door. "Good morning," he says, and the entire fate of Middle-earth pivots on what happens next. The thing is, the quest of Erebor worked. Not cleanly, not without cost, not in the way Gandalf had originally planned, because plans involving a dragon and a company of dwarves with centuries of accumulated grief rarely go cleanly. But Smaug died, not at Gandalf's hand, not at Thorin's, not even at Bilbo's, but at Bard's, with a black arrow and a piece of information that a small creature from the Shire thought to discover, and a thrush thought to carry. The chain of causes Gandalf set in motion produced the correct outcome through a series of proximate causes that he almost certainly did not predict in their specifics. This is how Gandalf works. He does not control outcomes. He sets things in motion and trusts the nature of the people and creatures involved to carry the momentum forward. He is not a chess player making precise moves to a foreseen checkmate. He is something stranger and more difficult. Someone who understands the character of his pieces well enough to know what they will do when they reach the board, and who then steps back and lets them do it. The Battle of 5 Armies was not in his plan. Thorin's gold sickness, and the return of the Arkenstone, and the arrival of the Eagles was not in his plan, not specifically. The discovery of the One Ring in Gollum's cave by Bilbo Baggins was absolutely not in his plan. That last development, in fact, Tolkien tells us was completely outside any foreseen possibility, was something that the narrative of Arda itself, guided by a power beyond Gandalf's calculation, arranged for its own purposes. But here is the thing. Gandalf had given Bilbo a position where that discovery was possible to make. He had put a hobbit into the Misty Mountains on a quest that required going through goblin tunnels in the dark. Without the quest of Erebor, Bilbo never goes to the Misty Mountains. Without the Misty Mountains, Bilbo never finds the ring. Without Bilbo finding the ring, Frodo never has it, and the entire path to the destruction of the One Ring is closed. This is not to say Gandalf planned it. He did not. But it is to say that his method, the method of putting the right kind of people in the path of important things and trusting their nature to engage with those things well, was precisely the method that made it possible for an accident of grace to occur. If he had sent a professional warrior to deal with Gollum and retrieve a ring, that warrior would have killed Gollum, taken the ring, used the ring, and become something that Sauron eventually drew back into his service. The fact that a hobbit found the ring and pitied Gollum and kept the secret for 60 years without being utterly destroyed by it is not incidental to the victory over Sauron. It is the victory over Sauron, in embryonic form, the day it happened. Now here is the question the script has been building toward its first return to, wearing new weight because of everything we have just seen. Gandalf spent 2,000 years preparing Middle-earth for a war he could see coming. He moved through every land and kindled fire in every heart that was willing to receive it. He engineered the death of a dragon. He refused power that would have corrupted him. He set Bilbo Baggins on the road that led to the One Ring being found by someone who could survive finding it. He did all of this with restraint as his primary method. And then, in TA 3001, 60 years after the quest of Erebor, he sat in Bag End with Bilbo Baggins, and the ring was in the room, and he still did not know. Was his restraint, the refusal to press too hard, too fast, to demand answers before he was certain, the thing that saved it? Or did those 60 years of uncertainty, those 60 years of the ring sitting in a hobbit hole in the Shire, with only the lightest surveillance, cost something that cannot be fully measured? Hold that, because what happened in those 60 years is the heart of what this script is actually about. The period between TA 2941 and TA 3001 is 60 years of Gandalf watching Bilbo and the ring from a careful distance and not moving. Not yet. Not until he had cause. Not until certainty justified the intervention. In Unfinished Tales, Tolkien gives us Gandalf's own account of his suspicions. He knew Bilbo had found something in the Misty Mountains. The story Bilbo told, the story about finding the ring as a gift from Gollum, did not quite track with what Gandalf could sense about the ring's effect on Bilbo. The way Bilbo described it, the way Bilbo talked about it, the particular quality of attachment that was already developing even 60 years before the farewell party. Gandalf was suspicious very early. He says this explicitly in reconstructed form through multiple texts. But he did not act. Because acting, in Gandalf's method, means something specific. It means taking hold of a situation and directing it. It means imposing his will on events in a way that goes beyond encouragement and begins to approach control. And the moment Gandalf takes the ring himself, or demands that Bilbo hand it over immediately, or does anything other than allow the process to unfold at the pace it can organically unfold, he becomes something he has spent 2,000 years being careful not to become. He becomes someone who decides for others. Tolkien establishes this principle across every level of his world. The Valar, in the beginning, failed Arda by trying to protect it from Morgoth in ways that removed the free peoples from their own history. They gathered the elves to Valinor and kept them there, and beautiful things were lost. They forbade the Númenóreans from sailing west, and the prohibition itself became the source of the madness that eventually destroyed them. Interventions by the powerful into the lives of the free, however well-intentioned, carry within them the seed of something that rhymes with domination. The road to Sauron is not always dramatic. Sometimes it begins with a wizard deciding he knows better than a hobbit what should happen to a ring. And Gandalf knew this. It is the deepest form of his restraint, not just strategic patience, though it was that too, but a genuine and principled refusal to make choices on behalf of the beings he served, because he understood that the whole point, the entire cosmological purpose of the free peoples of Arda, was to make their own choices, even bad ones, even slow ones, even ones that cost 60 years. So he watched Bilbo, and he worried, and he visited, and he noticed the particular way Bilbo talked about his ring, and he noted it in the long memory that has been building for 2,000 years, and he waited for the moment where his intervention would be welcome, rather than imposed. That moment came at the farewell party. Tolkien's account of the moment in Bag End after the party, when Gandalf and Bilbo stand across from each other over the question of the ring, is one of the most quietly terrifying scenes in all of The Lord of the Rings. Because Gandalf gets angry. Genuinely, blazingly angry, in a way that reveals something he keeps under control almost always, The full weight of his knowledge and his care and his long patience, pressed up against the resistance of a person he loves, who is being slowly devoured by a thing that does not devour cleanly or quickly, but persuades its victims that they are not being devoured at all. Tolkien writes that when Gandalf pressed Bilbo, Bilbo called the ring his own, his precious, using the word that is Gollum's word, the word of the ring's deepest hold, and Gandalf told him to give it up, not asked, told. And when Bilbo pushed back, Gandalf revealed, briefly, something of his full self, a shadow of power that made Bilbo step back and apologize, and gradually, slowly, with enormous difficulty, put the ring down. Picture this, the moment after Bilbo leaves. Bag End is quiet in the way only a home just left by its long inhabitant can be quiet. The fire is still burning, the pipe is still warm, and Gandalf stands in the middle of the sitting room and looks at the ring on the floor where Bilbo has left it, glinting in the firelight, and he does not pick it up. He stands there for how long? The text does not say. Long enough to think about it, certainly. Long enough for the ring to make its case, because the ring always makes its case to those who can sense its nature, and Gandalf can sense its nature better than almost any other being in Middle-earth. He said himself, at the Council of Elrond, that Narya is in his hand, and the ring knows it, and he would be more powerful than he can imagine if he took the One Ring. He said the temptation to use it for good is precisely why he cannot use it at all. So he stands there, and he does not pick it up. He picks up the fireplace tongs. He picks up the ring with the tongs, deposits it in an envelope, and puts it on the mantelpiece for Frodo. The most powerful moment of restraint in the entire Lord of the Rings is accomplished with fireplace tongs. That feels right, actually. That feels exactly right. But the 60 years are not just a story about Bilbo. They are a story about Gollum. And Gollum is the thread that changes everything about how we understand what Gandalf was doing and what it cost. Smeagol found the ring in TA 2463. He killed his cousin Déagol for it on Déagol's birthday, on the banks of the Gladden River, and then fled into the misty mountains with it, and stayed there for approximately 500 years, until Bilbo took it in TA 2941. That is 500 years of the ring reshaping one creature according to its full and patient capacity, turning a Stoor hobbit into something that had lost his name, his language, his capacity for love, and nearly his capacity for speech. Gollum lost everything to the ring in 500 years. Bilbo had the ring for 60 years and gave it up. 60 years of influence, and he gave it up. With effort, with Gandalf's help, but he gave it up. And Tolkien explicitly tells us in the appendices and in Gandalf's account at the Council of Elrond that hobbits' resistance to the ring was real and unusual, that their simple appetites and deep groundedness made them harder to dominate than beings of greater ambition and pride. But after Bilbo gave up the ring, there was still Gollum. There was a creature who had been the ring's slave for 5 centuries, and who, Gandalf eventually realized, knew something specific and dangerous. He knew the name Baggins. He had heard it from Bilbo in the riddle game in the dark. Baggins. Not just the ring, but a location for the ring, a name that Sauron could use. Tolkien tells us in the appendices and in Gandalf's account at the Council of Elrond that Gandalf hunted Gollum for years after TA 3001, with no success, before Aragorn finally captured him in TA 3017 in the Dead Marshes. That hunt is one of the least dramatized elements of the entire pre-Fellowship period, and it represents Gandalf operating at his most stretched, his most exposed, his most clearly aware that the clock he had been managing for 2,000 years was running out. Think about the texture of those years. Gandalf is 60 and more years past the moment he first suspected the ring. He knows Bilbo had it. He knows Gollum knows Baggins. He knows Sauron is in Mordor and gathering strength. He knows the One Ring is sitting in a hobbit hole in the Shire. He cannot move too fast, cannot expose the ring by acting too publicly, cannot draw Sauron's attention to the Shire before the ring can be moved. He is racing, but he has to race quietly. He goes to the Shire. He goes to Minas Tirith, where the archives of Gondor hold records he needs to examine. Records of the ring's last known whereabouts. Records of Isildur's account of the ring, that the appendices confirm existed in the archive, and that Gandalf found and read in TA 3017. He tries to find Gollum. He tries to find Saruman, and is delayed, imprisoned on Orthanc. And this is the moment where the long game almost collapses, because Saruman is no longer even pretending to be on the same side. Gandalf went to Orthanc in September of TA 3018 for counsel, because even then, even knowing Saruman's vote against the attack on Dol Guldur, and knowing the shape of Saruman's obsession, he was still operating within the framework of the White Council, still treating it as a resource to be used, rather than an enemy to be fought. And Saruman showed his hand. He imprisoned Gandalf on the pinnacle of Orthanc, and refused to let him go. Gandalf spent September and October on top of Orthanc, alone, under the stars, while the world below moved toward crisis. Picture this: Gandalf on the peak of Orthanc in September. Below him, Isengard is transforming, the trees falling, the machinery starting up, the Uruk-hai breeding in pits he cannot quite see. The night sky above him is enormous, and clear and indifferent. He cannot communicate with anyone. He cannot send messages. He cannot warn Frodo, cannot reach Aragorn, cannot tell Elrond anything. Everything he has built across 2,000 years is moving toward its crisis hour, and he is sitting on a rock in the dark. And then Gwaihir comes, the eagle, sent by Radagast, who was himself sent by a chain of events Gandalf had set in motion by sending Radagast to look for him. He is lifted off the pinnacle, and he goes, not to the Shire, not to Rivendell, not to wherever Aragorn is. He goes to Rohan. He needs a horse. He gets Shadowfax. That too feels right. Even in crisis, even in the moment directly after his imprisonment by a treasonous former ally, Gandalf does not move in a straight line. He builds in layers. He acquires the fastest horse in the world and begins to run. We need to sit with Saruman for a moment, because Saruman is the dark mirror of everything Gandalf built, and the contrast between them illuminates something about those 2,000 years that is very easy to miss. Saruman also spent 2,000 years in Middle-earth. He also had knowledge, wisdom, experience, relationships, and access. He was, in many observable ways, more impressive than Gandalf. He spoke better in councils. He commanded more obvious respect from kings and rulers. He had Orthanc and the Palantir of Orthanc, and a genuine mastery of lore that was not fake, was not performance, was real knowledge about real things. He knew the history of the Rings of Power better than almost anyone alive, and his understanding of their craft was as close to Celebrimbor's as anyone living could achieve. And he lost. Not just the war. He lost himself. He became, in the fullest sense, a lesser and uglier version of Sauron, using Sauron's methods, serving Sauron's structural logic, even while telling himself he was Sauron's enemy. The reason, Tolkien makes clear across the letters and the texts themselves, is that Saruman fell in love with power as a category. Not this power or that power, for this reason or that reason. Power itself, the machinery of it, the theory of it, the contemplation of the One Ring as the supreme artifact of power available in the world. He could not be near power without reaching for it, and eventually the reaching became him. Gandalf did not fall in love with power. But this is the strange thing. It is not because he was immune to it or lacked the nature that could love it. Letter 156 has Tolkien explicitly say that Gandalf was more powerful than Saruman in certain fundamental respects, that his nature was genuinely great, that Narya was appropriate to him precisely because the magnitude of the fire that needed kindling required a fire of matching magnitude to kindle it. Gandalf was not restrained because he was small. He was restrained because he was large enough to understand what reaching for power would do to him. Here is what nobody asks about Gandalf's refusal of the leadership of the White Council. Everyone reads it as humility, and it is humility. But it is not simple humility. It is the humility of someone who looked at what leadership of the White Council would require, felt the pull of it, the genuine pull of a great nature toward appropriate authority, and said no, specifically because the pull was there, because he could feel himself wanting it, because wanting the right thing in the wrong way, with the wrong orientation of the will, leads to the same place as wanting the wrong thing. This is the most sophisticated ethical reasoning in the entire legendarium, and it belongs to a being who looks, from the outside, like an eccentric old man who likes fireworks. Galadriel saw it. Círdan saw it. Eventually, Aragorn saw it. But most of the powerful figures of Middle-earth, most of the Dunedain lords and Elven lords and dwarf kings, looked at Gandalf and saw someone who should probably be more impressive, given how long he had been around. Someone who spent too much time in hobbit holes and too little time in councils. Someone who had, somehow, not managed to become a power in his own right, despite 2,000 years to do it. They were not wrong about what they saw. They were wrong about what it meant. Because the absence of accumulated power in Gandalf was not failure. It was the work. The absence was the strategy. Every year he did not build himself into a lord was a year he was available to be a wanderer. Every relationship he maintained, instead of subordinating to himself, was a relationship that remained free, that could act on its own, that could do things he could not do himself. The web he built was a web of peers, not clients. And a web of peers can survive its weaver's absence in ways that an empire cannot survive the absence of its emperor. When Gandalf was on top of Orthanc, the web held. Not perfectly, not without cost. But Aragorn was in the wild, doing what Aragorn did. Legolas was in Mirkwood. Gimli was in Erebor. Frodo was in the Shire, unaware of the danger but placed there by 60 years of careful attention, in the care of a community Gandalf had spent 400 years befriending, with a gardener named Samwise Gamgee, who had, almost certainly, been observed by Gandalf with something approaching quiet satisfaction for years. Sam Gamgee. The appendices do not record when Gandalf first noticed Sam, but the texture of what Gandalf knows about Sam by the time of the Council of Elrond, the ease with which Sam's presence on the quest is accepted, suggests that Sam was part of the calculation, or at minimum was recognized by Gandalf as the right kind of presence for what was coming. And that recognition, that ability to see the Sam Gamgees of the world and know what they are worth, is not a tactical skill. It is a form of love. It is Olorin's gift, the gift of perceiving what is most essential in the hearts of those who have not yet been asked to be essential. It is what makes 2,000 years of wandering into something different from, and more than, 2,000 years of preparation. It makes it a relationship with an entire world. Now we have to return to something we set aside earlier, the question of Gandalf's death on the bridge of Khazad-dûm, and what it means in the context of everything we have been building. Tolkien does not treat the episode on the bridge as incidental. He treats it, in letter 156, and in the overall shape of the narrative, as a genuine turning point in the war, and Gandalf's own words about it are the most direct statement he ever makes about the nature of his mission and his power. He tells the Fellowship at the bridge, "You cannot pass," and then he spends everything he has to make that true. The Balrog, Durin's Bane, is a Maya like Gandalf. This is explicit in the Silmarillion and the appendices and broadly implied throughout. One of the Ainur who followed Morgoth into the world and was bound there in the catastrophe of the First Age. One of those who put on physical form as a weapon of destruction and could not fully leave it behind even after Morgoth's defeat. Durin's Bane had been sleeping in Khazad-dûm since the Third Age began, awakened by the dwarves of Balin's colony, and was now a power that even the orcs fled from. And Gandalf faced it, not because he was confident of winning, not because he had a plan, because someone had to stand on that bridge, and if it was not him, it was the 9 members of the Fellowship who had no comparable power to put against a Maya of Morgoth. Tolkien tells us in letter 156 that the duel on the bridge and the fall into the water and the battle in the deep places of the world that followed were not Gandalf winning by superior strength. They were a genuine fight in which Gandalf was, for a time, dead. Not dying, dead. He was sent back by the Valar, by the direct intervention of his senders, because he had been removed from the board too early, and the mission was not complete. Think about what that means for the 2,000 years we have been tracing. All of that, the web, Narya, the Shire, the quest of Erebor, the White Council, the cultivation of Aragorn's line across the centuries of the Rangers. All of it was done by a being who could, at any moment, be killed, who went to Dol Guldur alone, in disguise, knowing that if the necromancer identified him and decided to fight, the fight might not go in his favor. Who walked into the mines of Moria knowing the reputation of Durin's Bane and not knowing whether his power was sufficient to face it. The restraint was not the protection of someone who knew he could not be hurt. It was the restraint of someone who knew very precisely how hurt he could be and chose to stay within it anyway, because the alternative was becoming something that might survive longer but would no longer be serving the purpose he was sent to serve. Gandalf the White is not the same as Gandalf the Grey. Tolkien is clear about this. He comes back from the dead with greater power, with something closer to the full authority his nature possessed, but that he had been holding back, with less of the warm eccentricity and more of the cool clarity that belongs to a Maya operating at full capacity. And something about that difference, something about the loss of the restraint and the warmth and the pipe smoke, is genuinely a loss, even though the power is gain. Gandalf the White wins the war. But Gandalf the Grey was the one who made it possible to fight, and you cannot quite have both. Let us go back to something that deserves its own moment, because it connects everything we have been discussing about Gandalf's wanderings to the question of who he was when nobody powerful was watching. The Shire. Specifically, Hobbiton. Specifically, Bag End. Tolkien tells us in the prologue to the Fellowship of the Ring that the hobbits of the Shire remembered Gandalf as the man responsible for the fireworks at Old Took's birthday parties. This is their primary relationship with him. Fireworks. Not wisdom, not counsel, not the subtle encouragement that Narya was designed to kindle. Fireworks. The most festive and least serious thing a wizard could possibly bring to a relationship. And Gandalf brought them anyway. He brought them for generations. He showed up at Old Took's parties and made the night sky into something extraordinary and let the hobbits of the Shire attribute it to craft and showmanship rather than to the fundamental generosity of a being who could have been anywhere in Middle-earth doing something that looked more important. There is a line in the prologue, easy to read past. Tolkien notes that Gandalf was the friend of the hobbits and that his coming was always occasion for events of note. In Hobbit terms, that is the highest accolade available. Events of note. Things that get remembered. Things the gaffer talks about at the inn for years afterward. Gandalf earned that distinction not by being impressive in the Elf Lord or Wizard Lord sense, but by being present, by showing up, by caring across 400 years about things that the serious political world of Middle-earth would have considered too small to bother with. Picture this. Sometime around TA 2890, the year Bilbo was born, a grey-robed figure walks into Hobbiton and stops at the garden gate of a comfortable hole in the hill. He stands there for a moment, watching a small hobbit child tumble around in the garden, and something in his face, the long face with the grey beard and the eyebrows too bushy for any respectable face, something in it is simply happy. Not strategically satisfied, not relieved that a piece on the board has arrived in good condition. Just happy. The way anyone is happy when they see a new life beginning in a place they love. He watches for a moment. Maybe the child looks up and waves, with the total unself-consciousness of a small creature who has not yet learned to be suspicious of strangers. And Gandalf waves back. And then he walks on, because this is not the moment. It is too early. The game is not yet this far along, and he has roads to walk and places to be, and a chess match against an eye that does not sleep to continue managing. But he comes back. He always comes back. This is the emotional truth of everything Gandalf did across those 2,000 years. He came back, not because he was supposed to, not because the mission required it in any specific tactical sense, but because he loved these places, and these people, and the coming back was not separate from the mission. It was the mission. Every return was an act of faith in the value of small things. Every time he sat in a hobbit sitting room and smoked a pipe and listened to someone talk about the harvest or the family gossip or the extraordinary boringness of the Sackville Bagginses, he was doing what Olorin had always done in Valinor, moving through the community, tending the small fires, keeping the warmth alive. The world was saved, in the end, by the fact that a gardener loved his master and would not leave him. The world was saved because an old hobbit felt pity toward a wretched creature in the dark and did not kill him. The world was saved because a small person from an agricultural community in a corner of the world that nobody with power had ever bothered to take seriously turned out to have exactly the kind of character that cannot be corrupted by the thing that corrupts everything else. None of that was an accident. None of it was luck, exactly. It was the product of 400 years of a wizard visiting a hobbit community, because he found them interesting and good, and those 400 years of interest and goodness shaping a people who were, when the moment came, worthy of the weight placed on them. You could call it a strategy. You would not be wrong. But calling it only a strategy would be like calling the sea only wet. We should talk about Aragorn, because Gandalf's relationship with Aragorn and with the long line of the Dunedain Rangers that preceded him is one of the most consequential investments Gandalf made in those 2,000 years, and one of the least visible in the main narrative. The appendices give us the skeleton. Tolkien traces the line of the chieftains of the Dunedain from Aranarth, the first, in TA 2106, down through 16 generations, to Aragorn II, born TA 2931. Each of these men lived their life in the wilderness, in secret, protecting the lands of Eriador without acknowledgement or thanks, maintaining the blood and the line of Isildur against the day when the heir of Elendil would be needed. Gandalf knew about this line. He cared about it. The appendices do not record how many of those 16 chieftains Gandalf visited and supported and encouraged. But given his method, given what we know about how he built his webs of trust, the suggestion that he maintained relationships with the Dunedain through those centuries is not speculation in the loose sense. It follows directly from Tolkien's own account of Gandalf's method in Letter 107. His job was to inspire courage and strengthen the wills of those who resisted Sauron. The Rangers were exactly those people. They were resisting Sauron's slow erosion of the West with their bodies and their lives, unglamoured and unpraised, and if there was a fire that needed kindling anywhere in Middle-earth across those centuries, it was in the tired hearts of men who were protecting a world that did not know they existed. And when Aragorn was born, in TA 2931, Gandalf was there for the arc of his development, in ways the texts confirm and the films barely gesture toward. Aragorn was brought to Rivendell as a child, after his father's death, raised by Elrond, and told his true identity by Elrond and Gandalf together when he came of age at 20. Tolkien confirms in the appendices that Gandalf was instrumental in this, that he and Elrond together shaped Aragorn's understanding of what he was and what he was for. But it goes deeper than the coming-of-age ceremony. The appendices record that Gandalf urged Aragorn toward his long years of service under assumed names in Rohan and Gondor, learning war and governance from the inside, testing himself against the actual experience of ruling, rather than the theory of it. Gandalf sent him, in essence, back to school. Not a school with teachers and lessons, but the school of the world, the one that teaches by making you fail in consequences, real situations until you have learned the thing that failure teaches. Aragorn served under Ecthelion II of Gondor as Thorongil. He served in Rohan. He led rangers in the wild for decades. All of this was, at least in part, because Gandalf advised it, because Gandalf understood that the heir of Elendil coming to his throne without having earned it would be a king in name only, and that what Middle-earth needed at the end of the Third Age was a king who was real, who had lived the life of his people alongside them, who could be trusted because he was trustworthy in fact, rather than by lineage alone. This is a 2,000-year project, with a 70-year endgame. Gandalf has been tending the Dunedain line since TA 2106 at the latest. He has watched 16 men grow old and die in the service of a cause they believed in but could not see the end of. He has stood at, or near, or in memory of, those endings and the beginnings that followed them. And in TA 2931, the last one is born, and the thing that Gandalf has been carrying in the back of his long memory across 800 years of waiting begins to feel like it might actually arrive. Aragorn is the culmination of one of Gandalf's longest investments, and Gandalf does not tell him that. He does not say, "You are the piece I have been moving across the board since before your great-great-grandfather's grandfather was born." He says, "Go, learn, come back when you are ready, and trust that the world will hold long enough." Which brings us back to the question of whether the world held because of Gandalf's restraint or despite it. Because Aragorn came back, finally, fully came back as himself, in TA 3018 at Bree, which is the last possible moment. Any later and the Fellowship falls apart before it is formed. Any later and the heir of Elendil is not in position. The timing is that fine. The margin is that thin. 2,000 years of preparation, a margin measured in weeks. Does that make the preparation wise or barely sufficient? Does it mean Gandalf got everything right? Or does it mean the world survived by a thinner edge than any of his long planning deserved? Here is where I want to make a connection that the casual reader of these texts almost never makes, because it requires holding the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings in the mind at the same time, and watching what happens when they touch. In the Silmarillion, specifically the Ainulindal and the Valaquenta, Tolkien establishes the fundamental cosmological principle that governs everything Gandalf did, that Ilúvatar's design is not overruled by the actions of the powerful within it. Morgoth poured his nature into Arda, and made it part of the material world's substance, and the music of Ilúvatar simply incorporated that discord into a deeper theme. Sauron made the One Ring the master instrument of his will, and concentrated his power into it, and the ultimate consequence of that concentration was that when the ring was destroyed, Sauron was destroyed with it, permanently, unable to rebuild again, because there was nothing left to rebuild with. The principle is, evil devours itself. Not immediately, not without enormous cost, but inevitably, because evil is parasitic on good, and the host will outlast the parasite if the host can be kept alive long enough. Gandalf understood this. It is, I think, the deepest foundation of his restraint. He was not simply being strategically careful when he refused to accumulate power. He was operating within a cosmological law that the only victory available to him was the kind of victory that could be won without becoming Sauron. That using Sauron's methods against Sauron was not a shortcut to winning but a guarantee of losing, because the person who arrived at the other end of that road would not be Gandalf anymore, would not be Olorin, would not be the being Círdan recognized on the dock at the Grey Havens and trusted with a ring of fire, would be something else, something that had started good and become the enemy's image by degrees. This is why, when Frodo offers Gandalf the One Ring in Bag End on the night of the revelation, Gandalf's refusal is so vehement and so specific. He says, "Do not tempt me." He does not say, "I don't want it." He does not say, "It would be useless to me." He says, "Do not tempt me," because he knows what he would do with it. He has thought about it. He knows the answer in his bones, the answer that has been developing for 2,000 years of watching power corrupt every being who reached for it, including Saruman, including Denethor, including Boromir. He would start well. He would intend good, and the intention would not be enough. The ring is specifically designed to corrupt through the best intentions. It does not tempt with obvious evil. It tempts with plausible good. It says, "With this, you could save them all." And Gandalf knows, with the particular clarity of a being who has spent 2,000 years saving them slowly, one heart at a time, that saving them all in one motion would cost exactly the thing that made them worth saving. their freedom to need saving in the first place. This is the emotional crescendo I have been building toward, because it is the thing about Gandalf's 2,000 years that is genuinely heartbreaking and genuinely right simultaneously. He spent 2,000 years holding back, not because he was weak, not because he was uncertain, but because he was committed, with a depth of commitment that almost no other being in his world managed to sustain, to a principle that required him to accept loss after loss after loss on behalf of a long-term vision that he could feel in his nature but could not guarantee with any certainty. He lost Bilbo to 60 years of the ring's slow influence. He lost Saruman to obsession. He was overruled on Dol Guldur by a white council, whose head he had refused to become. He was imprisoned on Orthanc at the moment the crisis was beginning. He fell into Khazad-dûm and died there, and had to be sent back because the world was not done with him yet. He watched Boromir take the wound of the ring at the breaking of the Fellowship, and could not stop it. He watched the Shire get scoured and could not prevent it. And he did it anyway, all of it. Every setback and every loss, and every moment where the restraint that was his deepest commitment produced consequences that looked, from the outside, like failure. He kept walking. He kept returning to the people he loved. He kept kindling the small fires. He kept believing, against every near miss and every almost catastrophe, that the method was right, that the world, held with open hands instead of clenched fists, would find its own way through. This is not the wisdom of someone who never doubts. This is the wisdom of someone who doubts and continues anyway, because the alternative is not certainty but its opposite, the certainty of a Saruman or a Sauron, the certainty that comes from having decided you know better than the free peoples what should happen to them, and having taken the steps necessary to ensure it. Gandalf never decided that. Not once. Not even at the end. There is a moment in the appendices that almost nobody stops to notice, but once you see it, it reframes the entire emotional arc of the War of the Ring. After the destruction of the One Ring and Sauron's defeat, after the coronation of Aragorn and the weddings and the farewells and the slow journey home, the appendices record that Gandalf accompanied the hobbits back toward the Shire as far as Bree, before parting from them. He did not see the scouring. He did not go in to help. He met them afterward, already knowing what had happened, and he had this to say, that his time in Middle-earth was nearly over, that others would have to deal with the wounds of the Shire, that the hobbits had grown enough to see to their own troubles. He had done his work. He was saying goodbye, not dramatically, not in the elvish sense of the great leave-taking. He was saying goodbye the way he had always done everything, quietly, on the side of a road, with a word or two that meant more than they appeared to, and then turning and walking the other direction. And then he went to the Grey Havens, where Círdan had been waiting, as Círdan was always waiting, at the last dock at the edge of the world. And he sailed west. Think about that departure in the context of everything we have traced. He arrived at that same dock 2,000 years earlier, with a gift he had not earned yet, given by the oldest watcher at the world's edge, who looked at him and saw the weight he was going to carry before he had carried a step of it. And now he leaves from the same dock, 2,000 years later, the weight discharged. Narya goes west with him, back to the hands of the Valar who sent it. His body, which he had worn like a coat for 2,000 years, is presumably also done with. Olorin goes home. What did it cost? 2,000 years in a body not entirely your own, moving through a world where almost no one understood what you were or what you were doing, watching the people you loved suffer under threats you could see more clearly than they could, but could not simply remove, because removing them would require becoming the thing you were fighting. Building and building and building, and watching the building nearly fall again and again, and getting up and continuing. What did it feel like, at the end? When he stood on the ship and watched the shore of Middle-earth recede, and the Grey Havens shrank to a grey line, and then to nothing, and the wind came up from the west. Did it feel like victory? Or did it feel like something quieter and more complicated? The feeling of having done the thing that needed doing, having paid the price it cost, and being finally, at last, allowed to rest? I think it felt like both. I think it felt like neither. I think it felt like something Tolkien understood in his bones, but could not name directly, which is why he put it into the body of a grey-robed wanderer with fireworks in his cart and a pipe in his coat, and 2,000 years of footprints on every road in Middle-earth. The feeling of having loved something enough to let it save itself. Now the question returns, for the last time, and it is not the same question it was when we opened. We have earned the weight of it. When we first asked, was Gandalf's restraint the only thing that could have saved Middle-earth, or was it the very thing that almost destroyed it? The question had a shape we could see but not yet feel. It was a framing, an opening, a door we were about to walk through. We have walked through it now. We have traced 2,000 years of footsteps, from the dock at the Grey Havens, to the firework parties of the Shire, to the dungeons of Dol Guldur, to the door of Bag End, to the bridge of Khazad Dûm, to the top of Orthanc, to the road back from the coronation. We have seen what the restraint cost, and what it built, and what it almost lost, and what it ultimately preserved. So ask it again. With everything you now know about those 2,000 years, was it right? Here is the devastating thing. The answer is yes. And the reason the answer is yes is also the reason the answer is almost unbearably yes, the kind of yes that has grief in it rather than triumph. Because if Gandalf had moved faster, pushed harder, taken the White Council's leadership, used Narya more aggressively, refused to wait for Bilbo to be ready, refused to trust the hobbits with the weight of the ring, and simply found a way to destroy it himself, more directly, with more power, Middle-earth might have been saved in a more controlled way, with fewer near misses, with fewer losses. But it would have been saved by Gandalf, not by Frodo, not by Sam, not by the free choice of free people, with all the anguish and risk that free choice entails. It would have been saved by a wielder, and the salvation would have tasted like the beginning of another kind of domination, however gentle, however well-intentioned. The restraint was right, because it was the only path that preserved the thing being fought for, not just the lands and the peoples and the trees and the rivers, the freedom of the free peoples to be the authors of their own salvation, to choose, with full awareness of what they were choosing, to carry the ring to the mountain, to choose, in the moment of greatest temptation, to fail and be saved anyway by pity and by the long, strange logic of grace, to be, in the end, not rescued, but completed, made more themselves by the ordeal, rather than reduced by it. Gandalf understood that from the beginning. It is written in the way Círdan saw him on the dock. It is written in the nature of Narya. It is written in every road he walked, and every fire he kindled, and every morning he knocked on a round green door, instead of doing something more impressive with his time. He understood that some things cannot be given, they can only be grown. And so the question, returned to for the last time, is not really a question about strategy anymore. It is a question about what it means to love a world. Whether you love it by protecting it from risk, by interposing yourself between it and every danger, by making yourself so powerful that nothing bad can happen as long as you are present, or whether you love it by doing something much harder, by trusting it, by believing that it contains, somewhere, the courage and the pity and the strange unlooked-for grace to find its own way through the dark. Gandalf chose the second kind of love, for 2,000 years, at enormous cost, and the world found its way through. Was he right? I think the question is not whether he was right. I think the question is whether we could have done it, whether any of us, given the knowledge of what was at stake, given Narya in our hand, and the ring's existence confirmed, and the clock running for 20 centuries, could have held back, could have kept walking, could have kept returning to the small fires and the hobbit doors, and the simple stubborn faith that the world, trusted with its own salvation, would rise to it. That is the question Tolkien left inside the shape of a grey wanderer, with a cart full of fireworks and 2,000 years of love on his back. I do not think it has an answer. I think that is why it still matters. If you have been sitting with this as long as I have, you know that the part of Tolkien's world that gets to you, really gets to you, is not the battles, or the darkness, or the ancient evil. It is the patience, the faith of people and beings who held on for so long that the holding on became indistinguishable from who they were. Gandalf is the fullest expression of that faith, in the entire legendarium. 2,000 years of it. Every road he walked, every fire he kindled. Every firework that bloomed over the Shire and faded into the summer sky, while old hobbits watched and forgot, and remembered and told their grandchildren and their grandchildren's grandchildren, and the story passed down in ways Gandalf never knew about, becoming part of the Shire's memory of itself, part of what the Shire thought it was, which was a place where the old wandering wizard came sometimes and brought marvels. He made them feel marveled at. That is not small. That is perhaps the largest thing he did. What do you carry away from 2,000 years of this? What does it make you think about the gaps in the stories you know, the figures who appear and disappear in the chronicles of any world, any history, who were doing something in the silence between records that the records cannot hold? I want to know what you make of Gandalf's restraint. I want to know whether you think he got the balance right, whether the losses along the way were the acceptable price of the method, or the failures of a being who should have trusted himself more. It is a real argument. Tolkien leaves it genuinely open, and the conversation is worth having, with everyone who has spent time in this world. This channel exists because these questions are worth the time they take. Because Tolkien built a world large enough and deep enough that you can spend a lifetime inside it and still find new rooms. If you want to keep opening those rooms, together, then stay close. There are doors in this legendarium that nobody has walked through yet. We are going to find them.